Welcome to a series where we talk about the World Cup histories of each nation at the 2026 World Cup. Today we'll be talking about the team that is literally always a dark horse, whether it's at the Euros or in a World Cup qualification group they'd inevitably choke in. Turkey has always had someone hyping them up, and usually that's me. I've fallen for the trap over the years, but they've had some good runs in the Euros. They've had one super notable run in the World Cup, and there's an exciting new generation of Turkish players that have revolutionized the national team. Let's get into everything. Our story technically begins at the beginning of the World Cup, but Turkey did not care to enter Uruguay 1930. They would withdraw from Italy 1934 qualification and wouldn't bother with France 1938, making Brazil 1950 their first qualification attempt. To make it to the World Cup, all the Turks had to do was beat Syria in a playoff, and goddamn did they. Turkey won 7-0 in the first leg, and sometimes I make the joke of, can't believe they made them play the second leg. Well, Syria literally didn't. They said, we're not winning this. Fuck off. Turkey was in the World Cup for the first time ever, and they didn't go, citing the cost of traveling to South America. Why the fuck did y'all enter qualifying? Their second qualifying attempt for Switzerland 1954 was very interesting. They played fourth placers from 1950 Spain. They got destroyed at the Bernabeu 4-1, then only won 1-0 in Istanbul. But in an era before aggregate score, this actually necessitated a Game 3 playoff. Played in neutral Rome, this game would finish 2-2, and I'm not kidding, a blindfolded local Roman teenager would pick lots, and he picked turkiye's name. This is one of numerous examples of cosmic forces deciding to actively fuck with Spanish football, but it sure benefited Turkey because they would actually attend this World Cup, believe it or not. In Switzerland, Turkey would actually be one of the seeded teams, only because Spain was seeded before qualifying, and Turkey was essentially wearing a Spain-like suit and assuming their identity, the same way Arya Stark would in Game of Thrones. This draw put them with the magnificent Magyars of Hungary, one of the scariest teams ever, but one Turkey would get to dodge due to the weird way of how groups worked in the 1954 World Cup. The teams Turkey actually got to play were West Germany and South Korea. Game 1 in Bern against West Germany, and the Turks scored immediately through Swap Mamat, but stood no chance from here. The Germans scored 4 goals, routing Turkey and making the South Korea game a must-win. Must-win they did, putting 7 goals past the Koreans and necessitating a playoff against West Germany again. This group format was so dumb because guess what happens? 7-2, West Germany beat Turkey's asses even harder this time, putting our Turks out of the World Cup. It's okay, I'm sure they'll be back soon, right? Turkey would withdraw from Sweden 1958 before qualification began, meaning we go next to Chile 1962. Here they would be drawn with the Soviet Union and Norway. This is a random-ass group. But despite winning both games against the Scandinavians, Turkey lost both games to the Communists, meaning it was the Soviets going through and Turkey failing to qualify for the first time, surprisingly. England 1966 qualifying saw Turkey put in a group with Czechoslovakia, Portugal, and Romania, and this went poorly to say the least. They lost 5-1 to Eusebio in Portugal, lost 6-0 to the reigning runners-up Czechoslovakia, and only got 1 win in the entire campaign, beating Romania 2-1 and losing their other 5 to finish bottom of the group. Mexico 1970 put Turkey in a group with the Soviets again along with Northern Ireland, and this time they lost all 4 games, each won by multiple goals. This was their worst performance yet. Turkey's group for West Germany 1974 included Italy, Switzerland, and Luxembourg, and they actually lost to fucking Luxembourg in the first game. They actually did okay after that, but came nowhere close to beating Italy, and thus nowhere close to the World Cup. For Argentina 1978, Turkey was in a group with East Germany, Austria, and Malta, and this started well with a win against Malta and a draw against the East Germans, but 2 losses to Austria ended any hopes they had here. The Turks would finish 3rd, once again nowhere near the World Cup. España 1982 qualifying was the absolute nadir for Turkish football, being drawn with Czechoslovakia, the Soviet Union, Wales, and Iceland, and losing all 8 games, scoring 1 goal, letting in 22. This is like impressive. Turkey is San Marino bad at this point in time. Turkey's qualifying campaign for Mexico 1986 included England, Northern Ireland, Romania, and Finland, and this went better. Turkey got a draw with Northern Ireland, 0-0, and this time scored 2 goals as opposed to 24 against in 7 losses. It's another qualifying campaign that Turkey spends in the basement the whole time, basically cosplaying as San Marino. Italia 90 saw Turkey put in a qualifying group with the Soviet Union, East Germany, Austria, and Iceland as the Pot 5 team, and finally they weren't horrible. They posted wins home and away against the East Germans and got a surprise 3-0 win over Austria to put themselves in a position where they could actually qualify for the World Cup if they won their final game against the Soviets. Unfortunately, they did not win that game against the Soviets, falling short 1-0 and pushing the World Cup drought now to 4 decades. For USA 94, Turkiye ended up in a group of fucking death, with England, the Netherlands, Poland, and Norway, along with San Marino. The Turks held their own in this group, winning games against Poland and Norway at home late in the campaign, but finishing in 5th place, nowhere close to the top 2 spots. It's now France 98, and not only is the World Cup now at 32 teams, but Turkey actually made the Euros for the first time in 1996. They didn't make it out of the groups, unfortunately, but this is progress. They got a more manageable qualifying group in 98, getting both the Netherlands and Belgium, as well as both Wales and San Marino. An early loss in Brussels and a 0-0 draw in Cardiff weren't great results early, but a big home win against the Dutch did put the Turks in with a chance here. Losing at home against Belgium was not ideal, but a 6-4 win against Wales was not only fun, but it put the Turks in a position where they could steal a spot in the playoffs with a win in Amsterdam. Unfortunately for them, they were shut out by the Oranje, with the game finishing 0-0 and Turkey finishing in 3rd place, out of the World Cup again. That gets us to Korea, Japan 2002, where Turkey would be drawn into a group with Sweden, Slovakia, North Macedonia, Azerbaijan, and Moldova. This actually went really well, as they drew both Sweden and Slovakia in their first round of games to sit in a 3-way tie with both after 5 games. They were held to a 3-3 draw at home by North Macedonia, but made up for that with a 1-0 win at Bratislava to open up a lead on Slovakia. With 2 games to go, Turkey had already wrapped up at least a playoff spot, and they had a chance to win first place and get an automatic ticket to the World Cup. That would have been insane, but they instead lost at home to Sweden and blew that. Still, Turkey would finish 2nd place, getting them a spot in the playoffs at least. Turkey would be drawn with Austria for a direct spot in the World Cup. The first game in Vienna still had quite a few Turkish fans, and the Crescent Stars were able to nick a 1-0 win thanks to a second-half goal from Okan Buruk. Then the playoff returned home to Istanbul and all hell broke loose. It was 3-0 Turkey by halftime, the game finished 5-0, and on aggregate, Turkey had just won 6-0 over Austria to book their first ticket to the World Cup for almost half a century. This is insane that Turkey had to wait this long in between World Cup appearances, but don't worry because it's about to make even less sense after you see what the Turks are cooking here. They would get drawn into a South Korea and get put in a group with Big Bad Brazil, China, and Costa Rica. You don't really ever want to be in the same group as Brazil, sure, but Turkey could legitimately advance out of this group in 2nd place, and who knows what happens from there. I'm not using the D word or the H word, but Turkey looks at this point like a sneaky bet to make it far. Their first game in Ulsan against the 4-time world champions Brazil could not have been a bigger matchup for the Turks, but this is what the World Cup is all about. In Turkey's case, they matched the moment, playing right with the Brazilians and actually taking the lead before half on a great pass in from Yildiray Bozturk, who found Hasan Sas past both Roque Jr. and Cafu. Hasan Sas finished past Marcos, and just like that, Turkey was beating Brazil in an honest-to-God World Cup game. Did it last? You probably already know the answer to that question. Ronaldo struck back on the other side of halftime to equalize, and Seleção would spend the rest of the second half searching for their winner. They got it too, although in controversial fashion. Alpay Özalan got shirt-tugging on Luzao and got called for the foul, which is 50-50 in my opinion. But this shit started and mostly took place outside of the box. This is not a penalty. This is an insane decision by the ref, but Rivaldo would bury the pen, and Brazil would escape with 3 points they probably didn't deserve. This was a great showing for Turkey, all things considered, and you had to feel like they could get Brazil if they had one more shot at them. We move on to Game 2 though, where the Turks would travel to Incheon to play Costa Rica, their biggest competition for 2nd place in the group. This was a weird game where Turkey dominated for a while, but it didn't really build on it until the second half, when Emre Belözoğlu scored a fluky-ass goal in the 56th minute to give Turkey the lead. Costa Rica would push from here though, and while the Turkish defense was able to hold out for a while, they weren't able to finish the job. Winston Parks scored what was equally a shit show of a goal in the 86th minute to equalize for Los Ticos, and the game would finish 1-1. Turkey now sat on 1 point with a game to go, and not only did they need to beat China, not only did they need Brazil to beat Costa Rica, but the Turks also needed to swing goal difference. So with that, we moved to Seoul for Game 3, Turkey versus China, and the Turks would take an immediate 2-0 lead with some bad Chinese defending on both goals, one from Hasan Sas and one from Bulut Korkmaz. They would dominate from here, getting a man advantage when a Chinese substitute got himself sent off, and while Umit Davala scored a really nice goal to put Turkey up 3-0, they really should have had 5 or 6. Still, they did enough to get the win, and with Brazil winning an absolutely insane 5-2 game in Suwon against Costa Rica, Turkey did enough to sneak through to the knockouts in second place. We just covered Paraguay yesterday, so you know what typically happens when you sneak into the knockouts in second place. You get matched up with Spain, Germany, Argentina, France, England, one of those type of teams. Instead of that, Turkey ended up getting the group winner from the infamous 2002 Group of Life, and we're now playing co-host Japan for a chance at making the World Cup quarterfinals. What a dream. Playing in Rifu, a small town in the Miyagi Prefecture, two teams with hopes and dreams of their first ever knockout win played a pretty forgettable game. Turkey took the lead on an early corner with Umit Davala heading the ball past Seigo Narazaki to effectively win the game. Japan just wasn't on their A-game here, and the Turkish defense held out pretty easily to steal the 1-0 win and secure their spot in the quarterfinals. Surely now they run into Germany, England, where'd everybody go? The 2002 World Cup was infamous for its upsets. Argentina was grouped, same with France, same with Portugal, and with South Korea going on their own reign of terror in their part of the bracket, all the Blue Bloods are dropping like flies. With all that said, Turkey would advance into the quarterfinals, where they would play Senegal. There were many teams in Korea and Japan that had less World Cup experience than Turkey coming in, but somehow Turkey just ran into one of them, with Senegal making it all the way to the quarters here in their very first World Cup. Incredibly, Africa's second team to ever reach the quarterfinals would match up against the Middle East's first team to ever reach the quarterfinals, and one of them was guaranteed a spot in the World Cup semifinals. I can't imagine what it was like watching the tournament live. It feels like the scriptwriters were like doing crack in the back for this one. Osaka would witness a cagey match between the Anatolians and the West Africans, and once again this wasn't a super memorable match. Senegal lacked the brilliance they had possessed in their other games, and this kind of became a mud fight. Turkey probably should have won this game in regular time, but their striker Hakan Şükür was having a very bad tournament, hence my lack of mentioning him up till now. And he really should have scored here and put the game away for Turkey. The game went to extra time 0-0, and then it happened. Just a few minutes in, keeper Rustu Resper would throw it out to the man who had just been subbed in, Arif Erdem. Omar Daf, Senegal's great left back, would get the ball off of him, but it went straight to Umit Davala. He would run towards goal and lash in across to the man who was subbed in for Hakan Şükür, İlhan Mansis. One header later, it was over. The 2002 World Cup had golden goals in extra time, meaning one single goal ended it. Turkey was going to the semifinals. This is insane. Turkey was now one step away from the World Cup final and literally their second ever appearance at the tournament. And it's here they would finally run into a world-class team. It's literally Brazil again. This has got to be the weirdest World Cup path of all time. But yeah, we have ourselves a rematch in Saitama. And this game was not the classic that their first encounter was, although both teams did have numerous chances in the first half. Both goalies were the stars of the show in the first 45, but after the break, Rustu would be the first one to let in a goal, being a bit at fault in a Ronaldo goal that the Turkish defense also did nothing about. This shit looked effortless from R9, and it turned out to be all the Seleção needed. Turkey's best chance came via Hakan Şükür, and surprise surprise, he didn't score, but this would have been a great finish if he had actually scored. He didn't though, and the game would finish 1-0 Brazil. The dream was dead, but the run was not over. Turkey actually still had a chance to medal, and they would play the other co-hosts, South Korea, for that third place spot. This game kicked off a run of some good third place matches at the World Cup, but that's not what you remember this game for. No, you remember it for this. After doing literally nothing all tournament, Hakan Şükür put himself into the World Cup history books, probably forever with this goal, giving Turkey the earliest lead in the history of the tournament. It wouldn't last long though because Lee Yul-yong hit a perfect free kick upper 90 to equalize in the 9th minute. The game stayed even for 4 minutes before Turkey took the lead again on another 1-2 between Hakan Şükür and İlhan Mansis, with İlhan getting the goal this time. İlhan would actually get a second in just the 32nd minute too, giving Turkey a 3-1 lead that would eventually hold. South Korea poured on for goals in the second half, and Rushdu had a pretty busy 45, and while they would get one back on a Song Chong-guk long shot, that came in stoppage time and it was too late for an equalizer. Turkiye would go into their first World Cup for nearly 50 years and emerge as bronze medalists somehow. This World Cup run must have felt like a fever dream for Turkish fans, but just like a real-life fever dream, reality sets in. This run would prove to be a mirage, a perfect storm of confluence, and just as fast as it came, it would go. There were still exciting times ahead, particularly at the Euros, but their World Cup history is actually over here. They've been in 2 World Cups, they haven't made one since until the one that's about to happen, and somehow in both of their World Cup appearances, they played the team that would go on to win the World Cup not once, but twice. That's one of the best Doofenshmirtz moments in World Cup history. So yeah, let's move on to Germany 2006. Despite not qualifying for Euro 2004, Turkey would still be a Pot 1 team and be placed in a group with Denmark, Euro winners Greece, Ukraine, Georgia, Albania, and Kazakhstan. This group kind of turned out to be a shit show, with Ukraine being the runaway winners of this group, and the Turks competing with the 2 most famous underdog Euro winners for the playoff spot. A home draw against Denmark late in the campaign left them vulnerable to either one sneaking up, but a win in Kiev against Ukraine was massive in getting them a cushion against both. A 1-0 win in Tirana in the final matchday made the other 2 teams' wins irrelevant, and while the automatic ticket would have been nice, Turkey was still going on to the playoffs. In these UEFA playoffs, Turkey would go up against the absolute line of mountains that was the Swiss national team around this time. Their recent glow-up turned them from European backpackers to defensive juggernauts, but make no mistake, the Turks were still the favorites here. And then the ball actually got kicked off for the first leg in Bern, and Switzerland dominated. They scored 2, they arguably could have gotten more, and the Turks came home embarrassed and emboldened. With an extremely tense atmosphere, Turkey went down 3-0 on aggregate in the 2nd minute on a penalty converted by Alexander Fry, and now Turkey needed 4 goals due to the away goals tiebreaker. They got 2 before halftime on a brace from Tunse, and a 3rd not long after halftime from Nakati Atesh. But even though they did get their 4th from Tunse, completing a hat-trick for him, it was after an 84th minute goal by Marco Streller of Switzerland. The playoff ended 4-4, Switzerland went through on away goals, and absolute chaos ensued. There was all kinds of accusations flying both ways, but what is undeniable is that a bunch of violence ensued afterwards between players, coaches, supporters. It was absolute pandemonium. This game in chaos is now referred to as the Shame of Istanbul. It seemed like this could lead to a complete dark age for Turkey, but to be fair to them, they would not only qualify to Euro 2008, but have a great showing there. In a wide-open group with Portugal, Czechia, and the co-host Switzerland, they would get a late winner from a young Arda Turan to get revenge on the Swiss, and then they got a late brace from Nihat to come from behind and beat Czechia, knocking both out and advancing to the quarters. In Vienna, they would match up against Croatia and draw 1-1 with a stoppage time second half of extra time equalizer from Semih Şentürk. In the ensuing penalty shootout, Turkey would win to advance to the semis of the Euro for what remains their only time ever. Here they ran into Germany, played a banger of a game, but despite a late equalizer from Semih Şentürk, they would lose to a 90th minute Philip Lahm goal to go out. Still an amazing tournament and real reason for optimism moving forward for the Turkey national team. South Africa 2010 saw Turkey in a group with Spain, Belgium, Bosnia, Armenia, and Estonia, and this was a group where the Turks could certainly finish second. Unfortunately for them, they just didn't get the results they needed. They only got 1 point off of Belgium, 0 off of Spain, drew 0-0 in Tallinn against Estonia, and despite getting 4 of 6 against Bosnia and Herzegovina, they would end up 3rd place behind both Spain and Bosnia, missing the playoffs and thus the World Cup, being one of a few notable exclusions from South Africa. We move on to Brazil 2014, where they were grouped with the Netherlands, Hungary, Romania, Estonia, and Andorra. The Dutch would run away with this group, and Turkey was in a 3-team race for second. After only getting 1 point out of their 2 games against Hungary and splitting with Romania, that was not ideal, but they still had a chance to grab the playoff spot with a win in their final game against the Netherlands. It did not happen, they lost 2-0, and there's no Turkey for 3 straight World Cups now. For Russia 2018, Turkey would get the best draw they could have conceivably hoped for. It was wide open, with Croatia, Iceland, Ukraine, Finland, and Kosovo all here. This ended up being a 4-way race, and with a big win over Croatia on matchday 8, Turkey sat tied with Ukraine on 14, looking up at Croatia and Iceland 2 points ahead. With a good last 2 matches, Turkey could have totally snagged a top 2 spot, but they instead got bodied by Iceland at home and then drew in Finland to end their campaign on a low, finishing in 4th place and out of the World Cup again. We go into Qatar 2022 now with the stink of Euro 2020 freshly on Turkiye. This was the tournament that cemented the Turkiye dark horse beam because this team was getting so much hype coming into this tournament, and they ended up losing all 3 of their group games, going home with an embarrassing 0 points. Their qualifying group for the 2022 World Cup included the Netherlands, Norway, Montenegro, Latvia, and Gibraltar. This definitely could have been a worse draw. Turkey would start off the campaign with a 4-2 win against the Netherlands at home thanks to a hat-trick from Burak Yilmaz, who I can't believe I hadn't said that name yet in this video. And they would follow that up with a 3-0 win against their other biggest competitor, Norway. Home draws against Latvia and Montenegro were not ideal, but the Turks still hit the halfway point of the campaign in first place, just 1 point above the Dutch and Norwegians. Then in Game 6, they got fucking demolished by the Dutch 6-1. After drawing at home against Norway, things all of a sudden weren't looking good at all. In Riga, a winning pen scored by Burak Yilmaz deep in stoppage time springboarded a 3-game winning streak to end their campaign, and Norway dropped enough points for the Turks to go through in second place. No automatic ticket once again, but at least they get a spot in one of the 3 brackets for the backdoor ticket. Unfortunately for Turkey, they got put in the toughest bracket. They had to play Portugal in the semifinal and then almost certainly Italy in the final just to get into the event. Oh my god. The semifinal in Porto was pretty dramatic, with Portugal taking a 2-0 lead by halftime, Turkey getting one back from who else but Burak Yilmaz. And then they got a penalty in the 85th minute with a chance to tie. Burak Yilmaz steps up, fucking skies it, and Turkey loses 3-1 to the Lusitanians to miss out on the World Cup for the 5th straight time. We'll take another quick detour before the end of the video to talk about the Euro 2024 because I low-key fell in love with this team during this tournament. In the group stages, they won a thriller against Georgia in their first game. Although they got beat by Portugal 3-0 in Game 2, they would beat the Czechs in Game 3 to take second in this group and reach the knockouts. They weren't even done here because they would upset Austria 2-1 to advance all the way to the quarters, their best runs in the tournament since Euro 2008. They lost 2-1 to the Netherlands at this point, but this was still an amazing run, and I was convinced by this run that we would be seeing them in North America in 2 years' time. That brings us to qualifying for North America 2026, where I ended up being right, but Turkey did start in a tough group with Spain, a rematch against Georgia, and Bulgaria as the worst team. The Turks began this with a crucial 3-2 win in Tbilisi and followed that up by hosting Spain and losing 6-0. That's not a typo, they lost 6-0, and then followed that up by winning 6-1 in Sofia against Bulgaria. 2 more wins against Georgia and Bulgaria locked up second place, and they were never going to beat Spain in this group, so a playoff spot was always going to be the best Turkey could do here. The good news is they got one of the more manageable brackets, going head-to-head with Romania in the semis, with either Slovakia or Kosovo winning in the final. Turkey would host Romania in Istanbul for the semis, and this game was not good. Romania looked like straight ass. It never looked like the Turks were going to lose, and even though the game went to halftime 0-0, the great Arda Güler made sure it wouldn't stay that way for long. The young Real Madrid player put in the perfect ball from a long way out, putting the ball on a dime for Ferdi Kadıoğlu to finish the job. Romania mounted nothing of note. The Turks held on for the 1-0 win, and they were on to the final to play the Cinderellas from Kosovo. Turkey versus Kosovo for a direct spot in the World Cup. It's another David versus Goliath battle, and this one went shockingly similar to the Romania game. Kosovo was way less dire and terrible, but the actual game went similar. The two were 0-0 at half, but Kerem Aktürkoğlu would score early in the second half to give the Turks a 1-0 lead, and they would hold. Turkey's path to the World Cup was way less dramatic than the other 3 European playoff winners, but it was nevertheless just as sweet for their fans, who saw their insane, unthinkable 24-year World Cup drought end. They finally have a chance to defend that bronze medal. Turkey has the reputation of always being dark horses at the Euro, and that is 100% going to stay true here in North America, with some of the brightest young talents in the game headlined by the Galactico Arda Güler. The Turks are one of the most fascinating teams in the tournament, and their group ended up being very manageable. They would join the group headlined by the co-hosting United States, and with Australia and Paraguay as the other 2 teams in the group, there will be a big belief among Turkish fans that they could and probably should win this group. But will they? Shit, I don't know, but here are my group predictions anyway. I have the US opening the World Cup by losing 1-0 to Paraguay, while Australia and Turkey draw 1-1 to put La Rioja on top of the group after match day 1. I do have Turkey beating Paraguay in the second game, but the US are earning their first points by beating Australia as well. Then in the third game, I have Turkey beating the US down to the tune of 3-0 to win the group, with Australia beating Paraguay in the third game to assure their qualification as well. I predict Paraguay will have a boring as fuck World Cup and yet will finish ahead of the United States on tiebreaker, meaning my US will get grouped for the first time in 2 decades. I may be a bit pessimistic, but if this ends up being true, it will be the funniest thing ever and heads will roll. Thanks for watching video number 16 of 48, this Sweet 16. Turkiye has such a weird history. I'm glad I got to detail it here because it's strange how out of the spotlight they've been in literally every single World Cup outside of 2002, despite the fact that they have one of the stronger leagues in Europe and have always had talent. It was interesting tackling World Cup history from their point of view, and I'm happy to have them here for soccer purposes because they're going to spice this group up. Tomorrow, we're going to tackle probably the craziest project in this series. We're going to untangle the web of deep runs that is the history of the German national football team at the World Cup. Stay tuned, it's going to be a good one. Unfortunately for me, it's going to be a long one.